I don't think it matters.
Oh, dude, what are you talking about? That's 5 people we lost. Just kidding. All
I'm
right.
sure Russ is waiting.
Let me actually double check and make sure that I'm recording here. Recording. Check. Check. Listen to that real quick. Why is it so noisy?
Oh, that's a good idea.
Hold on. That was really. I'm gonna make a quick change here. Gonna make a change. See, we can talk about dead pop stars.
And welcome to the Static Void.
I told you, it's like 1999 all over again. We're going to talk about Com Plus and promoting.
Yeah, it is 1999. Okay, now let me start up Audacity again. See if this sounds a little better. Testing 1 2 3. Check. Testing 1 2 3.
We hear you.
Playback. I feel like I'm getting a lot of noise.
You sure you have the right mic selected?
Dang, you're freaking smart.
Experienced. Doesn't have anything to do with intelligence.
Check. Should be much quieter now. Check. Mic check.
Check 1 2. Check 1 2.
Check.
Breaker.
1.
Breaker. There's a smoky on your tail.
All right.
Are we ready?
Are we going to hold our breath?
Yeah.
Has that been working?
Yeah, until one of us passes out. It's
Ready
like a
when you
dare.
We are live broadcasting now, so we can make money, right? One of us turns it blue.
All right. Ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Hello, and welcome to the Static Void podcast. I'm Jess Chadwick.
I'm Todd Slater.
And I'm Chris Gomez.
And we are your hosts. We are recording this on the evening of April 26th, 2016. And in this episode, we are going to be doing a bit of a comparison between two incredibly popular Microsoft frameworks, WCF and ASP.NET Web API. More particularly, we're going to be talking about when or why would you choose one over the other. But before we get into it, just a quick disclaimer. This is not going to be a discussion on SOAP versus REST or RESTful APIs or Web APIs or whatever you want to call them. This is really very much focused on the two specific technologies, the two frameworks. So obviously we are going to be referring to SOAP and REST and Web APIs and things like that, but we're not really going to dive into it. I think that's probably another show that we probably have coming up, but really on this one, we're just going to focus on the framework. So let's start off with just kind of introducing them, just kind of give them a high-level comparison. I mean, Todd, do you want to start it off?
Yeah, sure. So Microsoft has built a lot of different communication stacks over the years. And circa around, I guess it was 2005 or so, they decided to create what was then referred to as Indigo, which eventually became WCF, Windows Communication Foundation. And their intent was, instead of trying to build or have 20 different ways of solving different technology problems, what if they could build one framework, the WCF stack? And the ideas behind it, when you first learn WCF, you always learn what they call the ABCs of WCF, which stands for address, binding, and contract. And the idea was the address was where is the thing going to be located? It may be an IP address, it may be a mailbox address, it could be anywhere physically you communicate to it. The binding was around what is the actual transport mechanism? Is it going to be binary based? Is it going to be talking to like an MSQ type of thing? Or is it going to be more like a REST type thing where you talk over HTTP or TCP or whatever else you would do? And then the last piece would be the contract, which is the message structure you want to send back and forth. Around that same time is when Microsoft was also heavily promoting XML and SOAP, which also kind of fit into that same mechanism. So a lot of people's first experiences working with WCF was around SOAP messages. One of the big guys behind WCF was Don Box, who was also giving the credit of creating SOAP. So there's a lot of cases where people kind of mix the two together, even though WCF was built really as a framework to do any kind of communication.
Right.
And then over the years, eventually, the web took off more and more, and Microsoft ended up trying to build probably 4 or 5 different REST-based type APIs on top of WCF. I think the first one was like the REST toolkit for WCF, I think was the first one. Then they had something called a Service Factory and a couple other ones. And eventually they ended up creating 2 other products which were very closely tied to Silverlight, the WCF data services, and then eventually they called those RIA services. And they were both kind of tied around it's when they introduced OData and things like that. And then eventually Web API came about sort of as a reimagination of what is the best way to do REST-based calls that really isn't tied on top of WCF.
Yeah. I think there was even an effort, right? Wasn't there the WCF Web API? It might have been called. And you could see the effort was to say we've done all the hard work of building an abstracted communication stack. Like, let's keep using it. They definitely tried that a few times.
Yeah, in different versions of ASP.NET, they try to make it easier and easier. At one point, you had one of the big challenges with working WCF was I had to put in this spaghetti of XML to define everything. Where I think it was around .NET 3.5.1 or 4, I can't remember the exact version. They introduced the bindless HTTP binding, where basically you didn't even need to define it. But the minute you want to do anything special, like you wanted to define how it was cached or something else, now you had to put back all the XML again.
Yeah. So I
anyone
think
who worked in the Silverlight time,
that WCF kind of got a bad rap and still gets a bad rap for being too complex. Because I think to your point, Todd, that it was very much it was a framework to basically do anything, right? So yeah, it might have been very much driven by SOAP in the beginning, but one of the things I like most about it is that it very much encourages a good pattern of like just create a class, right? And it even in the documentation, you don't have to create an interface, but the documentation is very much geared toward that. It encourages you to create interfaces and everything, and create your bindings and your contracts against those, and really encourages you to separate that contract versus implementation, right? Like
It's an abstraction for communication.
Yeah, but it also encourages good patterns, good practices is what I'm saying.
Sure.
Like the framework itself actually encourages that, and so that's what I've always loved about it. But I think it's always got a bad rap because there's a lot of potentially moving pieces, not that you have to use all of them, or probably you won't often use all of them or even many of them. You'll probably only use a couple of them, but there's also a lot of configuration. And for me, even though I have now learned how to, and it took a lot to learn, how to kind of avoid that configuration or use a very minimal configuration, even now, when I go and use WCF, I keep kind of running up against that wall of like, this thing is not working. It's not behaving the way that I expect it to, and I have absolutely no idea why. Because of that magic wiring that's just not obvious to me, even though I've been doing it for years, right? So I'm kind of defending it and attacking it at the same time, in that it's gotten a bad rap, and for some reasons it really doesn't deserve that bad rap because it's not as complex as people make it out to be. But on the other hand, it certainly does still deserve that bad rap because it can be incredibly frustrating to work with because there's a lot of options and what kind of looks like magic unless you really take a lot of time to learn it. And I have taken a lot of time to learn it, and I still don't really get all the magic. Right.
I think the key time that things really kind of started to not fall apart, but more of people started to re-examine if WCF was the right solution to things is when jQuery came about. Because it was very hard without jumping through hoops or trying to understand. You couldn't just make jQuery Ajax talk to a WCF service. You had to do a lot of different things to make it work. And if you're using Microsoft's Ajax toolkit, you used to actually put in, you'd had to define the WCF service as like a service binding inside of your, I forget, whatever you were using for update panel, the service manager. and it would generate a bunch of stuff for you. So again, it was too much of this sort of black magic.
Yeah.
And I think you hit on something else that's very important. When you first started working with WCF, you had to sort of like learn WCF, like a lot of the nuts and bolts, even just get a very simple thing started.
Yep.
Where with something like Web API or even MVC controllers, you just create a class and say public X and return something.
Learn some conventions, right?
Yes, it's convention for configuration.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that kind of hurt WCF a little bit was there was always this big push from the beginning in the SOA days of this idea that you should do contract first. And while you could create a WSDL with WCF and stuff, the big push was we'll just create a class to do that. And for a lot of people, they thought creating a class was the wrong way to create their contract first approach.
Right.
So it kind of like it didn't hit the sweet spot with anybody, right? It could do everything.
Right.
You had the people who wanted the very simple way to just get going. The learning barrier was kind of tough to get going.
Right.
You had the people who wanted the most purest form, and even there, it's like I don't want to create code. I want to write my WSDL by hand or whatever. So it kind of like it was the right solution, but no one really embraced it.
Right.
Right.
You've mentioned WSDL a couple times. So WSDL being the kind of automatically generated documentation, and even more than documentation, not just for humans, but for code generators, which to me is the best thing. I mean, I just talked about how cool it was that it encourages good patterns and practices, but even more important than that really kind of drives to its ease of use is this WSDL, right? Where you can take this WSDL and you as a human can just look at it and read it and get a lot of information. But more importantly, you can point a code generation tool at it and quickly and easily generate a client to consume that
proxy.
service or a proxy. Yeah. And I mean that is incredibly powerful. That has some downsides, which I'm sure we'll get into, but that's incredibly powerful, incredibly easy to use, as opposed to something like jQuery, where it might be easy to construct an AJAX request, right? It's just an HTTP request. You use get, put, post, delete, that kind of stuff. Hit a URL and get some JSON back from a web API or from a WCF service if you do it right. But there's nothing inherently describing that, and that's still today that I'm aware of. There are no code generation tools that allow you to generate client-side proxies against your web API.
Well,
at least no popular one.
Depends, right? I mean, it actually. So leading into the discussion on web API, like what is it, and if we were to contrast it, I would say, and this is a whole huge topic, right? I would say the number one way I would contrast WCF with web API is we just talked about how WCF is an abstraction. Gives you lots of different ways to configure and to communicate. We mentioned SOAP, but SOAP is not the only way to communicate using WCF. When you use ASP.NET Web API, you're using the web.
Yeah,
that's a commitment.
So it's in the name.
There is no abstraction there.
Yeah.
At least in terms of your transport, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be gets and posts and puts and deletes and whatever verbs you choose
over
to use.
HTTP.
Over HTTP. That's a commitment that you're making.
Right.
And I think the reason this came about is you mentioned, Todd, and we've talked about it, is the WCF team was charged with bringing this newfangled web API approach into WCF, and they just couldn't get it done in a way that made developers want to adopt it. And so it was handed off to the ASP.NET team, who already had ASP.NET MVC. So they already had an approach where you derived from a base class, from a controller, except to contrast MVC, ASP.NET MVC's whole goal is primarily to return a view of some kind based on actions that are derived from the URL. That's not quite what you want to do in a web API. In a web API, you're generally, you want to return some data partially based on the resource that the URL represents, but also the verb that's being asked for, the get, the post. And so what happened is that team said, well, we can't just quite use MVC, although I think I'm right about this, is that Stack Overflow was famous when there was no such thing as ASP.NET Web API. they wanted to return some JSON, so they just did it through MVC, and they were very happy about
Yeah, there's
pioneering
nothing
that
stopping
approach.
you.
Yeah.
Right. But Web API kind of it fills it in around the edges and gives you tools where with MVC you sort of just had to invent your own
Yeah.
conventions.
It also had a set of things like get was automatically get, post was automatically post. Like
Yes,
there were certain
right.
things because I called something get or use an attribute, that method became that. Where with MVC, you whatever you called it, that's what you had to call it, right? It was the convention wasn't there fully. Yeah.
Right.
That's
And
So, I mean,
conventions can be incredibly powerful.
yes.
Right. So, Web API is committing you when you use ASP.NET Web API. Let me start that again. When you use ASP.NET Web API, that's committing you to working over the web. But that was convenient. I mean, like you said, Todd, is the jQuery craze of at first. This is why it's called Ajax, right? Is well, let's just get some XML back. Why am I getting a proxy and connecting to an endpoint and getting this WSDL? Why am I doing all that? I just want some data. So let me get some XML back. And then, eventually the X became silent for JavaScript because we don't use
XML anymore.
It's definitely asynchronous JavaScript and JSON. I'm sorry, not and XML. But there are a couple movements towards beginning to standardize specifications and formats and beginning to create client-side generators, and you see some of this happening in Azure and other clouds. I believe that team embraced Swagger and will, if you deliver, a Swagger specification, which I'm going to just say is like a WSDL for a web API. That's how I'm going to define Swagger and other similar types of things. Then certain Azure services like Logic Apps will pick that up. So, but it's very immature compared to SOAP.
Yes. Well, and it lacks
SOAP
the
is extremely mature
specificity
compared to where the web API community has gotten.
Yeah. There's also Swagger is, I think, it's the most popular. I mean, it's awkward to make that statement because I can't really back it up, but it seems to be the most popular. There's also another big competitor, which is RAML, R-A-M-L. So that's one that I've seen. I haven't really used it in a project, but I did play around with it. I started actually documenting existing services by hand, and I kind of used this to prototype some services. So before the service actually existed, or before I implemented it, I actually used this to just document it, and it was very, very natural to write it by hand. It was very natural, whereas with Swagger, I've typically been generating it, right? So there's a plugin called Swashbuckle, or a module called Swashbuckle that you can use with Web API that generates Swagger for you,
right?
And for a bunch of other frameworks too, there are generators as well, and that basically just takes your Web API that you've already written. You don't need to do anything special. You can decorate it with attributes and things to give it more information. But with just out-of-the-box Web API, you can add this module and just say, hey, generate it, and it generates some pretty good Swagger. I'm not sure if there's anything like that for RAML, for RAML, but I mean, Swagger's pretty nice. But I mean, to your point of code generation and stuff, I'm not really sure it's there.
It's not as mature. No way.
It's not as mature, but it's also not as specific, right? The spec itself right now is not really as specific as something like SOAP or like WSDL or anything like that, which really defines like this property is this type, this specific type, and by this type like system dot int 32 kind of specificity, right? You don't have any of that in Swagger.
So
go ahead.
So let me ask a couple quick questions. One isn't a lot of the reason why some of this isn't mature because a lot of the consumers are JavaScript, where like why would we ever generate a class for JavaScript when you just get the JSON data and work on it directly?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. But when I consume these services, I prefer, you don't have to, but I always prefer to create a client-side proxy, right? A client-side service, a client-side API, so that when I consume it in my code, I'm saying, new RESTful service or new client service is actually a JavaScript class or a JavaScript object, and then I say client service dot get clients or get client by ID, and I pass in an ID, right? So in the same exact way that I would generate a proxy or a class for in C# for WCF, I want to have that same approach, and I use that same approach in my JavaScript applications as well on the client side, except that now I have to kind of craft it by hand. I did play around with a TypeScript generator, a Swagger to TypeScript generator, which I'm not sure if I open source that or not. I think if I haven't, I got to throw it up on GitHub. But we're actually using that at work right now, where I made a plugin to Swashbuckle and the Swagger page that basically just says export this as TypeScript, which is why I can say with confidence what I said earlier about the Swagger spec is just not that specific now, right? There's only so much information you can get about types and things like that. So it is much more useful. It helps describe the interface and everything, but it's not going to generate it for you. And really, how can it? Right? The benefit of or the reason that the WCF code generators can generate it is because you have the .NET framework, right? And so you have you have System.net, you have HTTP client, and all the stuff that works and powers it underneath. And there really is no standardization today on that. What are you going to standardize on jQuery? Maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, are you going to standardize on the Fetch API?
Also,
not yet.
You know, and I don't want to say that WCF and SOAP are the same thing because they're not, but I think that many people use WCF in the cases where they're connecting SOAP-based services. And what SOAP, you know, was built essentially by folks like Microsoft, IBM, Sun, who had two very similar languages with similar type systems. And SOAP allows the Java developer as well to generate a pretty solid client from the WSDL because they can map the types.
Right.
You know, an int in C# is pretty darn close, if not exact, to Java. And then the folks who maybe weren't, you know, those two languages, they could still do some mapping. Like if you're a Ruby developer, your code generator can map that stuff and get it good enough so that Ruby works, you know. It was a good business-to-business standard for that reason. We've talked about already is I'm handing you something that's pretty machine-readable and fairly human-readable in terms of WSDL and SOAP, which has nothing to do with WCF, except that WCF's a great way to implement that stuff because it's super easy.
Yeah, and you try to do it by hand for older toolkits, it was not easy at all.
Right. So how about security? Have you guys implemented security on either of these things, on WCF or Web API, ASP.NET Web API?
So I have, and probably the way I've done it, kind of done it with both the same way, which is an extra layer of security. So I've dealt with a lot of cases where I may have an API that's a closed API, but it's on a public-facing website, right? So it's on the internet, but it's behind a form-based type of security model. So anytime you put something on the internet, you can't always assume, particularly if you're just using username and password, that the guy who's calling you is your application. So one of the things I've always added was an extra. Do you ever looked at SAML? SAML was a token format from the WCF Star Federation. So one of the things they talked the idea were the idea around claims, and I'd always put in something where basically it'd have a application token that was also part of this token, and I'd get that token on the server and I'd interpret it and say, yes, this is the application that's calling me. I trust that application, so thus I'm going to let the user in, kind of thing. And I've done that with WCF, and I've done it now the last few times with Web API too. Having that extra layer of sort of a key, public-private key type of scenario.
Right. So with WCF, I've done a couple things. In a B2B scenario, where you can think of the servers on each end as kind of being the users involved, and there isn't anything more granular than that, then you can just simply use certificates and plain old TLS, and it's pretty easy to configure. And what's really neat is that if you kind of do WCF 101 jumpstart, reading straight out of tutorials and books, you'll get led this way, where you just go configure it in the web config, and you don't touch your code at all. You configure the certificate, you configure whether it's mutual auth, are you accepting a client cert or not. Now, there can be a little black magic there, and I say that because having worked with many third parties, I can think of many instances where I sort of became their instructor because they couldn't understand why it wasn't working, and I had fought the battles enough to say, oh, you're not trusting my certificate.
Yeah.
Well, sure we are.
Yep.
Okay, look, I promise you're not. and let's go, But that was a little bit of black magic there, and because what happens is most people, if you go get even some really great WCF books or tutorials or documentations that's out there, it gets you through setting up services and making what are essentially remote procedure calls, but that's kind of where they usually stop.
Mm-hmm.
Could you right now fire up Visual Studio and do that by hand from
For
scratch?
that scenario, yes. I remember it pretty well, and there's a couple
because
reasons.
you did it so much.
I did it a ton. I did it an absolute ton at one place, and then recently I've run into it again. Just recently, I mean, it's very timely, this discussion. But I'll tell you what I have forgotten. Todd was mentioning SAML, which is, I kind of gave you a B2B scenario where the servers are the participants. Well, what if it's not just servers that are participants? What if I need more granular user roles within that?
Yeah.
Like I need an application to say, I'm Jess, and here are my claims, and then I, as the server, say like, well, get out of here.
Yeah, I make a lot of claims.
That's called a federated scenario.
That's where you have to move to, WS security, SAML, and that stuff's even harder to find information on.
Yeah.
And then what's even worse is that it can be really difficult to set up in your lab to like even get it working.
So now you just lost me. Like if you can't even set it up in a lab environment,
it's hard. It is hard.
Yeah. Security is hard. That's the challenge.
Just wait until you've got to set it up with your third party. Another business that you have to interact with.
That may be running Java or something.
Oh, those were nightmares. And I'm telling you, that part of it is really, really difficult. Is you get connected up with this other business that you're going to do business together. There's obviously a ton of pressure from the business interests who are like, this should be easy. We picked a standard technology, SOAP, it's standard. and then you're staring at their errors, and then you've also got to be very confident yourself that you really understand the errors and messages you're getting from WCF and the Windows stack.
Yeah.
To say, I know what's wrong here.
Yeah, no, and that's my number one problem.
It's hard.
All those cryptic errors, and you gotta track it down.
Yeah.
What flavor of the standard are you using?
Right. It is really hard. But then I'll give you a good story too. So we were talking about how this is timely. Out of nowhere in the last 6 months, again, our business is going to connect with another vendor for the benefit of the customer, and they said, well, hey, you know how we like to connect? We have this whole document, and so the document gets delivered to me, and I open it, and I go, it's SOAP. It's that scene in Jurassic Park. It's a SOAP system.
Yes,
I know this. So they just use SOAP, right? And they even put in there the WSDL for the service, the imaginary service that they would like to connect to. So I said, this is great. I'm just going to go implement this. Now, I'll tell you, there were some speed bumps in the road there because the SOAP that came out of that they were presenting didn't quite match up with the default SOAP generated in the WCF world when I just implemented the classes and made the data contracts and the operation contracts, and I hit go and I looked at the WSDL and I went, dang it.
Right, exactly.
Dang it, the actions aren't quite right and the methods aren't quite right. And this is I agree with you, Jess. This is frustrating. But then I did find, though, and look, I had to go digging and research, whatever. I set a few attributes on a few methods and a few operations, and I got it to match. So what was the
But that's
good part
almost
of the story?
It's almost more frustrating, right?
It
That
is
it's
frustrating.
so close but it's still not the same at all, right?
But here's what was nice, though. The first test between the two vendors, 100% worked, flawless, because I at least had a target where you could kind of argue that in a little bit more of a Wild West scenario, well, what did you send? Well, I thought we were sending base64 strings. Oh, well, I didn't know that. I thought we were sending XORed strings, right? I mean,
all right. So on the other side of the equation, we've got Web API, right? ASP.NET Web API, which is tied to HTTP. So you've got all the authentication and security mechanisms of HTTP, right? So you've got basic auth off the bat. You've got digest auth, and you even have some newer things like JavaScript Web Tokens, JWT,
Yep.
things like that, right? OpenAuth, which I'm not saying is great, or the silver bullet. A lot of people have a lot of problems with it. A lot of people have completely written it off. But it's out there, and it's kind of a standard, has kind of a standard, and I'm doing that in quotes,
like OAuth
implementation.
And
Yeah. So I mean, we have these standards on that side as well, on the HTTP side. We also have the benefit of HTTP being far older and more mature. I mean, it might sound like I'm arguing for one over the other.
I'd argue.
Here's what it is with HTTP.
It's open.
Everybody's network is open to using it already.
Exactly. Yeah, and proxies and all of that.
I'm not even going to try to say it's more mature. I'm just going to say that it's IT friendly. IT's already opened the open port. They know how to deal with HTTP. They know how to deal with certificates. They know how to deal with that stuff. You don't have to be like, well, there's WCF, so I need you. You're gonna have to.
It's more of a standard thing. I think that's the important thing. I open port 80, it works.
Right.
And with WCF, I think a lot of times, like you were just describing, Chris, it was a very powerful tool, and is a very powerful tool, because like the scenario you described, WCF, I still believe, is the right solution to that, but it's better for those harder problems. Yeah. If I just want to get data from my web application into my system, WCF is overkill, right?
Yeah.
It's the wrong
tool. That's what people came to is, well, I'm getting all this WSDL, and now I'm getting huge XML objects, and it's really a remote procedure call layer is the way I look at it. I don't think of WCF as web APIs and ASP.NET Web API is a resource system, right? I'm going to either get a resource or I'm going to post to a resource, and then the server is going to do something with that data.
Right. It's all entities or resources, kind of synonymous, and collections of those resources or entities, right?
And I've always thought of WCF as an RPC layer.
Here,
go call this method over there with these objects and send me something back, or maybe send me back a fault. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and we're getting dangerously close to a discussion on REST versus SOAP, but that is kind of the point, right? Is that the programming model, the whole WCF as a framework is kind of set up for that RPC style. And as Todd, as you mentioned in your history, your opening history, there have been various kind of frameworks that were kind of put on top of WCF early on, and then later on baked into the current implementations of the framework that allow you to relatively easy for WCF, relatively easily expose JSON data, right? Send back JSON data, or use URI templates to have kind of dynamic URLs and things like that. And it makes it far easier, but it's still, the framework itself really kind of drives you or pushes you toward that RPC style.
Yeah, it was a shim. It really never worked. It was still kind of tacked on to make it sort of work.
You could make it work, but you really had to try very hard.
I've seen organizations use it to preserve their investment.
Yeah, sure.
Like I've witnessed that personally. They preserve their WCF investment by using, one of these flavors of WCF's web API, like you said, the toolkit or whatever.
The funny thing is, if you follow the pattern Jeff talked about in the beginning, with the idea of you implement an interface, if you follow that pattern, it's very easy to rip out WCF and plug in a REST Web API service.
Now, ASP.NET Web API does not force you to be RESTful. If you want to develop an RPC style interface, it's not going to stop you.
The conventions very strongly encourages it. It makes it a little bit difficult to not be RESTful. RESTful meaning that resource collections kind of approach in the URL, and leveraging HTTP verbs, get, put, post, delete as your CRUD operations.
I agree with you that it pushes you that way, but man, I've seen a lot of code that clearly did not get the memo. So it's not enforcing it so strictly that people don't just they make a ton of controllers and they get. Yeah. And I'm telling you, the get method might even be something like, oh gosh, this is gonna be terrible. The get method might be remove or open stores. Mm-hmm. It's like, that's like flipping a switch. That's not a get.
No, you
Yeah.
said it right the first time. The get method might be remove something from
Sure,
there, right?
I've seen that too.
It's a delete, right?
Remove something. Yeah.
We're
But
opening
stop you. It's not going to.
Pandora's box here because I'm actually would fall into this category, but it's not my gets. Actually, it's my gets the opposite way. I find a lot of times, sometimes I want to post to my gets because I don't want to use just the query string to do complex filtering type things.
We're getting dangerously close.
Yes,
to the
we're falling down the rabbit hole. There are arguments that the rest versus so is a different problem.
Right.
I think it's a good time to kind of circle back and talk about. We talk a lot about WCF, right? Like what is really the difference at this point, right? If I'm going to make that decision today, I'm going to open up Visual Studio. What is my driving points? And a couple things that I've identified is, and you guys jump in too if you feel like there are cases where you would always pick Web API. If I'm going to do JSON over HTTP, to me, you just use Web API. There's very little value introducing WCF in that scenario.
Why?
Because it's straightforward and easy. It's the at least what I've seen with Web API and the more later version of MVC and stuff is it's fairly scaled, so which means if I have a very large binary result set I'm returning as JSON, it just works. Where with WCF and stuff, a lot of times I had to go tap into that configuration and say, all right, well, this is going to be a large result set, so now I need to go change in configuration to make it work. Where with Web API, I can get a pretty big result set coming back without touching configuration.
Mm-hmm. And you said that Web API scales, implying that WCF doesn't? What does that mean exactly?
So scales as in, out of the box with WCF, when you're hosting over HTTP, the size of the information, the message you're sending back and forth, is like, I want to say 32,000 or something. It's a pretty small number because of the cost of serialization. With Web API, that number is higher by default. I don't remember the exact number over the top of my head. I just know that when I did a lot of WCF development for Silverlight, a lot of times we had to go change that configuration where I've returned very similar structures of data over Web API and really never needed to touch the max result size.
Sure. Okay. So you're talking about a smaller payload, a difference in the size of the payload that actually goes across the wire.
So
and that's really JSON versus XML at the core of it, right? And then yes, SOAP has headers and things like that, but HTTP has headers as well.
Yeah.
So I think that really is fundamentally just JSON versus XML.
Well, there's also just some XML hatred out there.
Yeah, it's a whole other conversation. So
which
to me,
I consider irrelevant. Like, who cares?
Yeah.
Right.
It's just people want to throw darts at things.
Right.
So my main reason is it just works. It's simple. With attribute-based routing, it's really simple, right? I could go right into my class, Web API class. I define whatever methods I want. And I say this is the URL I want to use. Compile code. It works.
You can do that on WCF too, right?
You could. And again, if you try to do the REST stuff, it really ever only worked with the get and post. You really never remember implemented the routing stuff into WCF. I think you could do it, but you had to jump through a lot of hoops to make it work. Because you had the idea was you would open the SOAP message up and different things. I don't remember the details. It was not simple. It required a lot of Chris was saying before. You can get it to work, but you had to jump through a lot of hoops to make it work.
Yeah. Right.
So to me, the idea is I can just literally within minutes I can create a class. I can return the structure of this data, go write a bunch of JavaScript code. It just works. Well, with WCF, I couldn't do that. I'd have to go figure out, well, what's the trick to make the jQuery Ajax call be able to call into my WCF service?
Yeah. So speaking of the payload that goes down, one of the big things that WCF proponents often cite is the serialization options. So Chris mentioned it earlier. We kind of glazed over it. The transport, right? So like HTTP is basically the default and only way in Web API, and in WCF you not only have HTTP, but you can also use TCP.
Everything.
Or named pipes,
Right.
or binary, or sorry, you could do binary serialization over all those transports, and then you could actually even use MSMQ. You could use a message queuing transport as a way of sending messages. It's all very message oriented, right? And then also the serialization, right? So you can do XML serialization or SOAP serialization by default, and then you can do JSON serialization. You can even do binary serialization, right? So that's again, that kind of speaks back to the versatility. And I think when we're talking about, do we want to use Web API or WCF, it kind of comes to, well, do you need any of that stuff? Are
Yeah,
you ever
that's
going to use a name pipe? Are you ever going to use a
yeah.
TCP? The architect in me loves the fact that I can do that, and I can just go into config and switch it on and off.
Right.
But
It
like
preserves
the
your code.
yeah, but the developer in me is like, no, dude, like I'm going to implement one,
Yes.
and I'm
Pick one and
never
let's
going to
go.
change that, because if
Yeah.
I change it, it's going to break everything.
Yeah, there's a ripple effect down to that. So that is probably to me that really comes down to two big things that WCF has over top Web API is it's not just tied to HTTP, and I have these other um, serialization options. Binary serialization is a huge thing. The idea that I could take an object, a whole set of objects, and convert it into a binary and ship it across the wire, and on the other side, it would be able to know how to open it back up. That's serious performance gains. Where with JSON, you can never get that, right?
At a huge cost, though. You have serious versioning concerns,
Yes.
versioning issues.
That is probably the
Yep.
caveat. But again, if your scenario is that scenario, you need that throughput. Your versioning is probably not as I would say not as critical, but the versioning is something you can do it every year or two, right? It's going to be more of a cadence to doing it.
Yep.
Where a web application really doesn't fit that mantra, right? I'm going to be creating some stuff, and then you can add some more stuff. If I have to regenerate my WSDL every 3 minutes, my head would want to explode.
Yep.
Well, we also haven't talked about how WCF supports scenarios like this. 2 Windows services on different boxes communicating via TCP.
Yep.
Yep.
2 processes that want to communicate over named pipes. I mean, forget the web, forget internet, forget even intranet at that point. You're just saying, I want something a little bit more flexible than like what we had early on, like .NET remoting. And then you preserve your code investment if you say, I think I want that endpoint to be a web-based endpoint. You can host it anywhere. Host it in an app. Host it in a service. So it's just extremely flexible. But then the price you paid is that it's extremely flexible for a core Microsoft developer, and then maybe a few other folks who've implemented SOAP interfaces. But then you get to the Web API world, which obviously just completely took over, and you're out of luck.
Yeah. Well, those have been the scenarios that I've seen WCF really, really, truly shine, is that kind of back end, or rather middle tier, kind of peer-to-peer conversation, right? Getting data from one server to another, or even from one process to another process on the same machine. So you can apply that really good architecture of this application or this service or this process does one thing and one thing well, this other one does another thing. They need to kind of interact with each other, and so they do that through something really performant like name pipes.
Yeah.
Right. So they still talk to each other, and theoretically they could be on 2 different machines, and they could be across the world from one another. But for performance reasons, we happen to host them on the same exact machine, and so it's a process-to-process call that's completely avoiding the network stack and everything. But if I have another instance across the world, for redundancy reasons or whatever, I can just use configuration to just switch over to that. So now I'm using TCP, I'm going across the world, and I'm hitting that other one, right? So those have been the scenarios where WCF has really shined, and I think is still really incredibly relevant. But a lot of in terms of the quantity of needs of the implementations that I've been doing these days, at least, have not really been that kind of server side B2B, server to server communication. It's really been more client server communication, specifically web client communication.
Yeah.
Right? So even if we're talking about mobile devices, even if it's not a browser, even the mobile applications today they talk JSON and RESTful APIs, web APIs, much easier than XML and certainly SOAP.
Well, and it's what developers are using too.
Yeah.
You can go hire developers who will understand, calling web APIs, calling RESTful services, and they can just go to work. it's probably getting harder and harder to find someone with some WCF expertise.
Yeah, I don't know about that because
I see it out there, sure.
I mean it's always been difficult to learn, right? I've been using WCF for how old is it now? You know,
At least 10 years.
At least 10 years. I've probably been using it for close to 10 years. And I cannot go and do anything from scratch with WCF today, right? Like I've been using it for almost 10 years. It's so complex that
you do have a head start though.
I have a head start, and I can figure it out within a couple of hours, right? And I can remember back to all that pain that I went through and kind of really work my way through it. And when it really does suit the scenario, like the scenarios that I was just talking about, like that server-to-server communication, it is magical. It's amazing, and it's actually a pleasure to use. Again, primarily because of the good development patterns and practices that it encourages, right? And so when it works, when it's doing well, like it is a real pleasure to use. It feels easy. It's not easy. You need to, you need to spend a lot of time configuring it and putting all that plumbing in place. But once you've got it and you're just kind of adding on behaviors and stuff, it feels really good. Whereas when I'm doing a spa or something like that, it's the exact opposite, right? It's web API is the thing that just feels really easy and really good to use. And when I have to use WCF to send down JSON to a browser, it feels painful. It feels like
just throw in that monkey wrench right there, right?
Yeah,
it's a browser trying to call back to the server for some reason, or a mobile device. And once you throw that monkey wrench in, that's it. The developers are going to be out there looking to hire. That's what they're going to expect.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, because it's just far simpler to do that, right? Lower overhead, leverages HTTP, which is the language or the transport of the web. It's been around since literally it is the web, right?
Right.
And so it's just there. Everybody knows it. If you're a quote web developer, you almost by definition need to know it or understand it, and it's
right.
Or at least accept that's what it is. On the web, that's what I'm going to use. There's no choice.
On the web, we have user-centric patterns. So we had cookies that was a pretty good browser to server user-centric pattern, but now we're slowly moving to tokens because that's a little bit easier on mobile, a little bit easier in SPA, right?
And more
now for APIs,
right? So now, when you consider you're in that world, you're in a web and mobile world, you are user-centric. It's more important to know who I am. And we were just talking a little bit earlier about how painful that was in WCF. Just absolutely painful to be like, oh, I've got to go implement SAML tokens now to get granular user permissions. But if it's straight B2B, no problem. But now I got to know not just that it's Todd, not just that it is the server from that business, but that it is Todd or that it is Jess or that it is Chris.
Yeah. By the way, I think you mean mobile first, cloud first.
Mobile first, cloud first world.
That's the world we're in.
So it's funny in a way. We've talked a little bit about this, how we talked a little bit about Swagger and stuff. When more and more people talk about microservices, I start to feel like, so we're going to try to reinvent WCF, or what WCF was very good at, that sort of communication, services to services communication.
Every class of service.
Yeah, everything's a service, right?
I'm stealing from.
It's not like it's not a conflict, right? I mean, you use WCF. You can use WCF to implement microservices.
Oh, you definitely can. What I'm saying is, in the context of today's world, a lot of people are talking about REST-based web API when we talk about microservices. It's an evolution that eventually we're trying to reinvent everything that we sort of had before, and eventually I think we'll reach a pain point where it's going to fall into a bucket. WCF will fit into this niche of type of application development. Web API will fall into this one, and there may be other things that make even more sense for other type of scenarios. There isn't one solution.
That's really funny that you just kind of spelled that out for me, because you honestly just changed the way that I thought about things. As I've been kind of learning about and doing microservices lately, doing them not entirely seriously, but I've just, they've always been a very middle tier technology for me, and as I just got done saying, WCF is just amazing for middle tier, so I've just kind of always associated in the .NET world WCF with microservices. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing stopping you from making a a RESTful microservice or even an RPC style microservice that uses JSON and HTTP as the transport, right? So you can use Web API or WCF to create a quote microservice, because what is the definition of a microservice after all? But
Yeah.
the definition that I've been using is very much middle tier centric, right? Server side.
I just think a lot of people, when they start talking about mobile first and stuff, a lot of people are starting to kind of equate the mobile application talking to the microservices, which,
Sure.
because REST and JSON is sort of the universal standard now, it's easy. And I think ultimately that's to me the driving force, because I was not a fan of actually still not really a fan of REST in general, but even Web API for a long time I'm like, I'm just going to use MVC controllers. I don't need this other way to do things. It took me a while to really grasp the benefits between them. There are scenarios where it just works, and to get started, you really within minutes you have something working.
The benefits of Web API over ASP.NET
With JSON
MVC?
and REST over HTTP, yes. The benefits of HTTP with JSON. If you're going to talk to a client like Chris was talking about, a user-based client is going to communicate to a service, it's generally easier to get going with a REST Web API type service as opposed to WCF. At least that's my opinion, based on what I do today. Like that, to me, that's the decision. If it's going to be over HTTP and I want JSON, Web API is a good fit. If it's not going to be JSON and it's not going to be client to business, it's going to be more business to business, my instincts would drive me towards WCF.
Yeah, I agree. So the other thing that really, really begs to be discussed here too is that ASP.NET Web API as a framework is dying. No, but
it's merging. It's merging
right,
into one toolkit.
Right. So with ASP.NET Core, the kind of new iteration, the new evolution of ASP.NET as a full-fledged framework, there is no longer a Web API as kind of a standalone framework. It's just ASP.NET MVC, and you have the concept of controllers and actions, and you can create APIs with those controllers and actions, right? I mean, is that the summary? Is it really that simple?
Or you can return views. I mean, it sort of addresses the issue we always had that, okay, well, we have MVC, we have ASP.NET MVC, and we have ASP.NET Web API, and they're very, very, very similar. But, this one's tweaky in this way, and this one's tweaky in that way, and action filters work this way in MVC, and they work this way in Web API. And I think the drive here,
concepts, and some of the classes are even named the same, but they're not the same at all.
Well,
they're literally two full-fledged implementation. Yeah, that's always really, really bothered me. So I was really glad to hear that they were merged.
Right. Now that's made it a little tweaky. Now, I know that ASP.NET Core and MVC Core and all that is a moving target, but what I have seen is that some of the things you were used to, where you would just fire up a Web API project and some of the things you would get out of the box for free, you would get content negotiation for free, JSON or XML for free. If you want to go enable that in the new world, you got to go set some settings somewhere. Now, that may not bother a lot of developers. There are probably plenty of developers who have written off XML.
Right.
I kind of like having content negotiation. I think there are some really neat scenarios where the same resource, but asking for different content, is a very valid scenario.
They're
not as common. They're usually not what gets you out of the box, right? First thing you do is you get some JSON back.
I don't know. I just question. They seem more theoretical than practical, right? I love them too. They sound like neat scenarios. I would completely agree with that statement.
But then we're talking about going to work. Do you see it very often? I agree with you. I agree.
Never implemented it. And the one or two times that I said, "Hey, this looks like a good fit," and I got really excited because I could implement that academic, theoretical, awesome thing. It didn't really turn out, right? It was just overkill. It was over engineering when it was just simpler just to have some other implementation, right? Like a different controller action or something.
Right.
It was just far simpler to implement, and sometimes even simpler to consume as well.
Now, consuming web APIs, you see a lot of folks end up building clients in other languages. I mean, let's look at look at the cloud services. Look at everybody.
Yeah, well, it just
They don't
doesn't
actually
matter,
end up making you use REST. They end up
Yeah.
saying like, "Oh, are you a Ruby developer? Here's the Ruby toolkit for AWS or for GitHub or for whatever." Facebook, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that it's another layer of abstraction. So one of the things we didn't really talk about that I wanted to bring up a little bit is we talked before a little bit about Swagger and stuff, and when you guys brought it up, it reminded me a little bit of OData, which is another thing sort of on top of or part of the we'll call the web API stack, right? It's very easy to tap in and bring back OData type queries back and forth. And as far as I know, WCF doesn't really have anything like that. It's more of that message based thing. It doesn't have this idea for anyone who's not familiar with OData. The idea is OData, I can say, I can put on the query string different attributes that kind of sort of follow a standard that says this is the where clause, this is the sort by, this is the filter. And it's sort of a standard way of doing things. And I know a lot of people have built on top of Web API ways to tap into this. What do you guys think that fits in?
I've always kind of hated OData as a practice, as an approach. It seems lazy to me. It's basically saying, here's all my data, do whatever the heck you want with it, right? The APIs that I tend to create are a little more friendly, user friendly. Like, create scenarios and say, oh, you're probably going to want to get your list of users, right? And those users are going to have contacts, and those contacts are going to have addresses and things like that. And the APIs are implemented to serve those kinds of scenarios, identified scenarios, and serve them very well. Whereas OData is almost just like throwing your database on the internet, right? And it's basically database over HTTP.
The request is, right? Yeah. And
Yeah,
I'm not
right?
a big fan of OData either, but it sort of fits in that same thing, because that is something Microsoft has pushed heavy. And I mean, they've built a lot of their own libraries and frameworks. SharePoint, for example, or Microsoft CRM. They've built heavily into OData.
So
Office 365 is built
yes,
heavily around OData.
but those systems are inherently they don't have like specific use cases, right? They are inherently just like, here's a data store. It's just a different type of database. It's a place that you can throw some content in or some data in, right? SharePoint, it's lists.
Yeah.
Literally nothing more than lists.
It's content, right? List of content.
It's content, yeah. And then so here's OData, right? Here's a way to query and filter the data in those lists that you set up. Same thing with CRM, right? CRM, you set up some entities in a relationship database, and then here's a way to query them. But when you actually create applications, and those applications are driven by pretty specific business workflows and validations and things like that, a lot of the time the OData approach just kind of goes out the window. It just doesn't really apply.
Mm-hmm. So the reason why I brought it up is to be another area where sort of Web API shines is if you're Facebook or you're Twitter and you want to expose an easy way for people to consume your stuff, most of them have picked sort of a Web API approach. I'm not Microsoft Web API, but that same type of approach.
Right.
And I think the reason why ties into a lot of what our discussion was, it's just easy and it just works. I don't need to understand the framework you've written this in to consume it.
Yes.
Or WCF, a lot of times, it worked great when it was .NET here, .NET here, unless you were .NET 4.0 here and you were .NET 3.5 here, or you were Silverlight here and you were .NET 4 over here. And all of a sudden, all that magic things you had didn't quite work. It sort of worked.
Even then, it's not too bad as long as you're
but there were
.NET
problems,
to
right?
.NET. Yeah.
I mean, I remember in the Silverlight days, every freaking time there was an error, I got a 404. I'm like, I want the real error message, not 404.
Yeah.
It doesn't help me.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, for that problem, because I got an exception.
For that problem, you've got configuration, right? There's always
that's what you end up then doing, right? So to me, there were a couple of real reasons why people started to adopt these things is because it was simpler to get started, and frankly, people wanted JSON and not XML. If we were still dealing with XML over all places, I don't even think Web API would exist, because WCF handled XML perfectly. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, though, is that when you have alternative or I guess competing technologies, multiple technologies that are all trying to access a single service, they don't want to know or care what that service is written in. That service could be written in Python or ASP.NET or Ruby or whatever. it doesn't matter. I'm going to make some kind of standard request to it. I'm going to get some standard response back through JSON or whatever, right? And so, and kind of going back to the idea of microservices, it just shouldn't even matter, right? You could theoretically change your implementation from Ruby to ASP.NET Web API or something, but as long as it's returning the same JSON and the same HTTP headers and things like that, yeah, who cares? Literally nobody will care. You can just keep consuming it the same way.
It's super frictionless, right?
Yeah.
Compared to WCF or SOAP or anything
Yep.
like that, to just say, hey, just make a GET request. And almost there isn't a developer out there who doesn't have easy access to GET and POST requests.
Mm-hmm.
Your web browser does, right? I mean,
Yeah.
But even then,
web
like just
browser.
looking at your frameworks, like we have in the .NET world, we have HTTP client done.
Yeah.
Yep.
If you're in jQuery, you've got something. If you're in Node, you've got something.
Yeah.
It's easy.
So Microsoft's always been great at creating the tooling. So it is, quote, easy to create a client, a service proxy, and generate a service
Yes.
proxy from a WCF service.
Right.
But it's far, to your point, Chris, it's far easier to just open up Postman and
Yeah.
make a web
Yeah.
request, right? Or
Right.
for simple gets, you don't even need to open Postman. Just literally just
No.
type it in the browser, right?
Right.
It's a query string, query string based approach.
So I wanted to know, I wanted to find out about some personal experiences that you guys have had with this stuff. So we've kind of talked about it at a high level. We've even already kind of mentioned a couple of personal experiences loosely. But I wanted to get into it, just kind of, do you have any defining moments with either of these technologies where you used it, you chose to use it, or even chose not to use it on a particular project, and that ended up really being the right decision or the wrong decision, right? It really worked out well, or it really worked out poorly.
Okay, I guess
Right.
I'll jump in first.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I actually have an interesting sort of story around this. So a few years ago, I worked on a client where they wanted to move their application from VB6 LAN into a web-based technology, and their application was fairly complex. jQuery and the other things really weren't going to fit in for what we were trying to do. So we ended up building it as a Silverlight application. And the way it was architected, they had a number of middle-tier services that had to do a lot of work communicating with different databases and different systems. So we ended up building a WCF front end, or middle tier, that the Silverlight services talk to. Flash forward 4 or 5 years later, now we're in a situation where now jQuery and Angular and stuff is matured enough, we're going to tap in and bring Web API in. And because we architected our WCF services correctly through the interface approach, it's just fairly easy to now to let the Silverlight app still talk to that and now build Web APIs on top. It just returns the same structure of data. And the reason why I brought this up is, to me, this is the quintessential thing. You should think about these things not from a technology point of view, but through the business scenario you're trying to solve. In this case, it was, I have fairly complex large objects I need to send back and forth between a client and an application. The client would get the data, they would do a bunch of stuff, and they would ship it back, and then the server would process the data and stick it wherever it needs to go. To me, that's more important, and that's sort of my experience working with both technologies. The only other thing I can think of more recently is I've built a number of systems around Web API where we had basically the application on the internet, but it was a secure application, but it was meant anything's public facing on the internet, anyone can attack. I found it very easily, much easier in Web API compared to trying to do it with WCF, to tap in and build filters, like action filters, for adding additional security or different things I had to do. Where in WCF, there was sort of this pipeline, and I could do different things, but I almost felt like I had to do like 4 different things to solve the problem. Where in Web API, I create my filter, I go wire up the filter. It says, is this going to fire everyone? Or I put an attribute on top of Web API saying, for these filters, it needs to be this type of security, and it just works. So those are sort of my high-level experiences with both.
Yeah, makes it easy to attach behavior to your code without having to actually put code in line.
Or get into lots of configuration, because the minute I create my own custom transport and then channel, I now have more configuration to do. Where with Web API, it's like I created this filter, top at the top of my Web API controller, it works. It fires the right time, I get the right result. It's predictable.
Yeah. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, for me, we said it wasn't a SOAP versus REST discussion, right? Well,
Yeah.
if you need to consume SOAP or be a SOAP consumer or a SOAP service, then use WCF because you don't want it to suck and be hard.
You really don't have
You
a
don't
choice.
want the pain.
It's just really
Yeah.
easy. I mean,
Yeah.
look, you don't have to use WCF. You could go use the ASMX web services.
Oh,
That
let's
consumes
not even go
SOAP,
back to those days.
but
No, you can't. Let's
But
take that off the table.
but that's all that it did, though. That's all
Yeah,
that it did was
yes.
consume SOAP. But you could see the inspiration for WCF in the service proxies and whatever.
Right.
That's the obvious scenario. And I did mention earlier how working with a vendor, it was just really satisfying. The first end-to-end test just works, and you got to love being in front of the customer, because if you're any kind of customer integrating two businesses, you know it doesn't work the first time or the second or the third. Integration takes months.
Yeah, it's the most painful thing.
In this case, it was like, well, we're going to go for pizza.
Problem done. Drop the mic.
Yeah, the developers were done. Me and the other side, we were done. Drop the mic, like you said, and now the business people had to wrangle things out. That's unusual,
Nice.
and it was very satisfying
Yeah.
because it usually doesn't go that way.
Yes.
Yep.
There are also interoperability standards in many verticals. The healthcare industry adopted SOAP for a set of interoperability standards. And so they're having the debate too, right? They're now in the process of working on a RESTful standard. So, they're going where the developers are.
Yeah.
So I hate to say that's the number one reason to choose WCF. The other reason is that inter-process communication we talked about, because it is stupid easy. But I feel like maybe those scenarios are beginning to fade as more and more architectures are moving towards, I'm just going to be a service sitting somewhere, and I don't care how anyone hits me, just as long as they can talk HTTP, and I'll take care of the rest. And you're seeing those architectures come up, I think, just because it's where the developers are going. It's where your team is going, and you can hire people that know this stuff. You can consume it from a website. You can consume it from a mobile device. So that's when you would choose Web API, is when you say, I've got to have I like to call them Web APIs and not put the moniker in front of it, because they don't always have to be RESTful. That's a whole other religious war, right? And other show, and I hate the war part of it. There's good reasons for resources, and then there's good reasons for just making a call.
Yeah.
So just get it done.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have similar opinions as well. I mean, in my experience, the most painful thing about Web API for me has really been the lack of, I kind of alluded to it earlier, the lack of just kind of documentation and code generation, service proxy generation out of the box, right? So I just feel like I have to hand code everything when I'm consuming it. Typically, I'm consuming it from something like jQuery or whatever, so it's not that difficult. I've got frameworks to help me on the client side, but it just seems a little more difficult, or at the very least, yeah. So it's just a little bit more work than I should have to do, versus or compared to WCF, where it just generates it for me and it's there and I can use it. And I also mentioned earlier that the biggest wins for me for WCF were those really kind of service to service, server side service to service calls, integrations between two services on two servers, but even more importantly, transactional services, right? And so, long-running services, long-running kind of transactions, not necessarily atomic transactions, but I'm referring to dropping something on a queue, right? So I drop it off, and it gets picked up later, right? It gets executed later. That could be next year, it could be in half a second from now, but it's somebody else's problem, and it will probably get done at some point, right? It should get done at some point, and you get a lot of benefit out of that, durable messaging. So I know that if the entire system just completely crashes, when it starts up again, my messages will still be there, they'll still get processed. If my message is in a bad format or whatever, we'll have retries, and all of that stuff is just a whole lot easier in a system like that. versus if you try and implement that on Web API, if you try and implement transactions on Web API, adding transactions or creating transactions across multiple Web APIs, forget about it. Like you're just not.
Highwire-ect.
Yeah, you're just not going to do it. HTTP is not going to support that kind of transaction. So there are patterns that you can apply, right? The compensating transaction or the two-phase commit, where you talk to service A and you say, all right, save this, but don't really do it until I tell you, or it'll go, then do the same thing with B and say, okay, and then, all right, you're both good? All right, go, both. Go ahead and save them. You can do it, but now you have to do all that work, and a lot of that is
you're in charge of the plumbing.
Yeah.
And the retries and everything else.
Yeah. But the web APIs they're far simpler, right? So when you just want to go, just basically execute some logic, grab some data, get some data with JSON in a lightweight format, quick updates, deletes, whatever, that kind of stuff. You're kind of operating on entities or resources. It's a very nice technology to choose.
So I think that's a good place to kind of summarize is there isn't one size fits all, right? I think we all have that kind of came to that same conclusion that your requirements should drive this, and if you have these set of requirements, WCF has benefits. If you have these sets of requirements, Web API has benefits.
Yep.
And I think that's sort of like the big problem as an industry we have. We worry want these silver bullets. When in reality, they don't exist.
Yeah.
You have to take the problem you have and apply architecture and technology to it, and then if it changes, well, then you need to build something else to solve that problem.
Absolutely.
One solution is to fix everything.
And on that note, I think that's a show. You, listener, what do you think? Have you used either of these frameworks or even both of them? So do you have a favorite one, or is there one that you kind of like tend to lean on more than the other, or something like that? We'd love to know. Please leave a comment on the website, staticvoidpodcast.com, or send an email to comments@staticvoidpodcast.com. And as always, if you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on the show, please feel free to let us know through those same channels. We want to make sure that we're talking about the things that you want to hear about. So Todd, Chris, thanks for the chat.
Yep.
Thank you.
And thank you, listener, for spending the time with us. We hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time on the Static Void Podcast.
And don't forget to connect your devices.
Devices.
To our web podcast.
Billions of devices.
I want you to love the podcast.
So I think I'm going to chop out the whole thing, the last section, the personal experiences. I think we were on a really good note before I asked that, and I think I'm going to chop that and then just go, hopefully it goes right into where you just ended it, Todd, to basically, remember there's no silver bullet or whatever.
Yeah. Should we stop recording, by the way?
Oh, yeah. No, I stopped. Oh, stopping the broadcast?
No. I meant recording in.
Yeah, I stopped recording.
So, do you guys have any problem with that? I mean, I'm disappointed that I lost the transaction point, because that's kind of a real big downside to using.
You could have that.
Let me add it, because you wouldn't believe some of the resurrection of points in the C# show.
I definitely think
20 minutes later that got moved back into place.
Really?
A couple places, yeah.
That's awesome. I've never been ballsy enough to actually do that.
Chris is an expert.
It was some work. I learned a lot about Audacity, though.
Yeah, it's a nice little piece of free software.
There was just one place in particular, because we had the same conversation essentially twice, and it was about the support in Visual Studio. We had it early, and then we had a point late that was just like totally, it almost wanted to be cut, because it just felt like we should really just end the show here. So I lifted it, moved it all the way back.
Alrighty. So Chris, before I forget, you didn't respond to my message the other day.
Yeah.
You want me to stop broadcasting here?
No, you can keep broadcasting.
Okay. We'll do
Can
some
that work
housekeeping.
for you? You don't have to tell me right tonight. Just let me know next day or two.
This is the NJ.net portion of the show.
Yes. This is a community outreach program.
Yeah, where we take care of the user group. WCF versus Web API. That was a solid show, guys. I like
Yeah, it
that.
was good. I think anything where we can have sort of that somewhat structured but open like approach, I think works. Like same thing with C Sharp. We sort of had these are things we're going to discuss.
Yeah.
While other ones we kind of were diving too much into the theory things.
Yeah, right. We didn't box it, right? We didn't say this is what's out of bounds and this is what's in bounds. And
So
we
what's
went through it
next?
without doing like basically. I mean, we like kind of quickly defined, REST and
Yeah.
I wouldn't say we really defined SOAP, but we kind of talked about what SOAP was.
Yeah, I think we dug deep enough without getting
No,
into.
yeah, I think it was perfect. The definitions were perfect. My point is that we had a very productive conversation without having to like go into detail about what exactly they were.
Yeah, I think June 9th could work. I was kind of thinking, so the July one would be this 14th. Both of them are open.
Yeah, I have someone who wants to do July, but I could probably push them into June.
That's all right. You can do June then.
Who?
Henry.
Oh, yeah.
So I just wanted to confirm with you first.
Yeah, I'll do June.
You'll do June?
Mhm.
All right, June 9th. Yeah, June 9th. That
All
works.
right.
So what's next?
What topic is next?
Yeah, what topic is next?
Well, you, dear listener, why don't you tell us what topic is next? I don't know. I really want some listener topics.
Where does business logic belong?
Oh, we should do that.
In the business layer.
In the business layer.
Well, I mean, there's the clear follow-up, which can happen immediately or can happen later, which is SOAP versus REST.
Well, yeah. Sure.
That'll be an interesting discussion. I'm not
even
sure
just
we
like
really
REST.
differ that much. Yeah, right.
I totally hate REST. I
know.
despise REST.
I think SOAP is going to be like, SOAP sucks.
SOAP sucks, REST sucks. Do what works for your application. Do Todd. Do the Todd way.
It reminds me of the Family Guy. He walks into a bar in New York State, and he goes, "Mets suck, Yankees suck, Knicks suck."
Exactly. They all suck. They're great for scenario X and Y, but they suck for everything else. So a couple of things that we have here on the list I thought maybe be interesting. We have Visual Studio Code, which is what 1.0. I'm not sure exactly
that's timely.
what we should dive into there, but maybe more about like if I'm a Visual Studio developer, like why do I care? What would drive me to want to use this?
Yeah, I put that on there, and really, it's awesome, and I want to give it marketing. Is really.
So I think that might be an interesting one. Kind of like why, like Jess, you've had a lot of experience with it. I've used it here and there.
I'm using it like exclusively for Node.
Exclusively, yeah, for Node, awesome.
Yeah.
So we should put these notes in there. So why do you want to use it?
Are you guys doing Node experimenting with Node or using Node in like real world scenarios?
This is me doing my DevOps stuff where like I have a project where there's a website and a web API and they're both GitHub repos, and when I push to the production branch it just magic happens. But they're both Node projects. And I just use Visual Studio Code for everything. For debugging, I've come up with a debugging workflow, everything. Now, I mean, I need part of what I'm doing is I'm kind of trying to come up with a workflow, trying to come up with something that I think is really productive and that I could teach to another developer. And then specifically, I am teaching it to another developer. He's a brand new developer, so I'm using it for that. Now, you don't have to use Visual Studio Code for that, but what's kind of neat is it's in the box.
Well, I mean, we don't have to get into it now, but that would be good to understand because I have it installed, I've used it, I was in their pre thing,
right? Sure.
And then a lot of times I'm like, Sublime this works too, for what I was trying to do. So, like, I'm such in the Microsoft world that it doesn't. It's a nice tool to have, but it's not. Nothing drives me to want to use it day to day.
Yeah, I understand. I think there are some use cases, and then when the new ASP.NET drops, there is kind of the intended use case of you're not a Visual Studio developer and you're on Linux, well, use code.
Well, yeah, well, that makes perfect sense, right? If I'm going to be cross-platform, that would make sense.
For folks like us, right, who live in the MSDN world, you're already looking at this full-featured IDE that you have plenty of experience with. It's not like you're saying, "Oh, I don't understand the IDE; it's too hard." It's your flight deck. You're used to it.
Yeah, I think too, and the reason why I brought this up is because it's 1.0 now. The rule of my experience is when something comes 1.0, it's much easier to sell to your customers or to your workers, even though this is the thing you buy. And I guess to me is the idea that what you guys are describing is more a bleeding edge, cutting edge, where I think the average developer, he's just a Visual Studio. So like, what does this tool do for him? What are the benefits that, hey, if I do this in here, it's going to be easier as opposed to Studio. So that's, I think that would be of use. The other one was hiring developers. I really think that's a topic to have at some point.
Hiring or being hired?
No, how do we... Well, the question I like to ask is, how the heck do we find the right people for the job?
Yeah, my goodness.
I feel like that narrows our audience, right? To managers. Unless we can...
But it could be both, right? It could be people who are interviewing. It's people who are interviewing, like,
yes.
A lot of people just don't seem to be prepared. People that claim, like, I know .NET, okay. You start asking some .NET questions.
But what is the theme of the show? Is it commentary? Is it how to? Is it?
I think the question is sort of, as a .NET developer, what the hell should you know, right? We use the Sky Huntsman sort of thing, right? You used to have a blog post, what every senior .NET developer should know. So when you're applying for a .NET job, what should you know? Or Microsoft Stack job.
.NET.
So, again, I'm not sure if that's the right. Huh?
.NET would be a good start.
Yeah,
obviously VB.NET.
Oh yeah, well.
COBOL.NET.
COBOL.NET. Anyway, I think we just do code
lately,
kind of
but
interesting.
I can answer any COBOL question.
What should every .NET developer know? JavaScript.
Yes. Describe a closure in JavaScript.
That's one of the questions I ask.
What about in C#? They have closures.
I'd be happy if people could answer me, what does that mean when a string is immutable? And what the frick? Explain to me the garbage collector. Oh, it collects things. Okay.
Explain the difference between this in JavaScript and this in C#.
I've asked that question. And you see the eyes glaze over.
How about we just rapid fire interview questions at each other?
Okay, I read this today.
I know one.
What are you reading currently?
Oh yeah.
Did you catch that one?
I heard you say it. Yeah. I thought the pattern was. I thought what you were going to say is his name a pattern. Name two patterns.
Name a pattern other
and
than.
if you say singleton, you're off the podcast.
Exactly. Should you ever use static void?
Yes, right.
The answer to
the
question
sound effects from The Price is
never,
Right.
never, except when you absolutely need to, and then maybe.
Yeah, and then only until you can refactor it.
Yeah, exactly. If you feel the urge to write the word static, stop, take a hammer, pound your head until that feeling goes away.
Static can be okay if you're being purely functional, because then you have no need for state.
Okay. These are people who are like, it's going to be more performative if the class is static. It's a helper class.
No, that's ridiculous.
And then they're like,
No.
Then they have a scenario of, well, then that's not. Then we need to make everything thread safe. It's like, well, if you didn't make it freaking singleton static in the first place, you wouldn't have had any problems.
Sorry, you lose.
If you have a pure function, then it not only can be static. I mean, why not? It is accepting input and returning input, modifying no state. Now, most people don't write their code that way in C#.
It's because in ASP.NET, the worker process, if something gets stuck in Gen 2, it never gets collected. That's evil and bad.
But I'm not doing that. I'm not modifying state. Pure function. But most people don't write code that way in C#. Most people don't. Usually you're the F# guy. Or you're like me, I'm trying to bring some functional stuff in because it just makes thinking about stuff easier.
And I've used static recently for almost the exact scenario we're talking about, where
But I
I can't
agree with
remember
you
why I
about static void.
didn't create an extension method. Actually, I think I did create an extension method. There was something I didn't want to create a extension method for, and I'm like, I'll just use static. I'm like,
I agree with you
don't
about
want to.
static void, because what static void says is you really just didn't want to inline the code. I have a chunk of code and I hated staring at it, so I made it into a function and I moved it over there. It's like, great, thanks.
And I made it static, or I made it.
What it probably
yeah.
means is that you're doing too much in this class or this method.
Yeah. Well, in my
I made
scenario,
it
it's
static
like
for performance reasons.
you shouldn't be making the decision that something is singleton. You should let DI help you do that and use a good framework, and then you can configure it. And then if it doesn't make sense to be a singleton anymore, you change the framework,
Right.
and then you move on. You
It
didn't
shouldn't be
compile
relevant.
it into the code.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It should be your application's decision, not the component's decision.
Or if you're writing a library that's going to be consumed by different clients, the host application should be able to make that choice and not just be stuck with your code. Sorry.
You know, that's an interesting point. Is your library allowing consumers to still make good architectural choices? That's actually really hard. Because a lot of people write a library and then they'll have like an asynchronous method, but it's actually like a fake asynchronous method. It's really synchronous.
Turn the live off and we can have a nice little discussion.
Sorry, internet. Goodbye.
You need to go off the internet.